Good morning, everybody. My name is Andrew Hone. I'm the president and CEO of the Portland Business Alliance, which is Greater Portland's Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to all of our members. Welcome to the November video forum, the penultimate forum before the end of 2020, which I know most of you are just counting down the days. Everyone here at the Alliance truly hopes you're well. And as many of you know, last week, our governor announced a stay-home order across the state and here, of course, regionally effective today. So we hope you are coping. And of course, we are a resource to all of you and encourage everyone to practice safe physical distancing and help us contain this virus in the year ahead by wearing your mask. During COVID-19 closures, we continue to work diligently to be a resource to all of you, and our website is updated frequently. Of course, please visit portlandalliance.com and follow us on social media for updates. And you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and elsewhere. And if it didn't happen on social media, it didn't happen. A recording of this presentation and links for the resources mentioned will be available on our website later today. Of course, none of these events could be possible without the support of our members, and we have incredible members. And I would like to thank today both KeyBank and the Portland Tribune. So thank you again to Key. And now I want to turn it over to Mark Garber, who is our outstanding partner over the Portland Tribune. Mark, I hope you're doing well and welcome.
Thank you, Andrew. Hopefully the technical issues will not affect us here. Yeah, and good morning to everyone. I just want to say I'm looking forward to hearing the perspectives of our excellent panel today. If you'd asked me this time last year, what would be the biggest issues or the biggest news stories of 2020, I would have said probably the November elections. But that was before COVID, before the recession, before George Floyd, before the protests, before the wildfires. So, being a news organization, we've been very busy at Pamphlet Media Group covering one of the newsiest years I can ever remember. And so by the time we got to the elections, it was really interesting to see how everything had changed. All the political conversations had shifted over the past 8 or 9 months. We have 24 newspapers which publish in print and digitally and covering dozens of communities. So our journalists were literally tracking more than 100 local races and ballot measures. And it was pretty evident that the issues that the candidates were talking about before January were very different than what they were talking about both in the May primary and the November election. So and all that, all those changes weren't just specific to Portland. We saw that in all the suburban communities and the smaller communities that we cover too. So I'm really interested to hear the conversation this morning from this great panel. I also want to say thanks to the PBA again for keeping us all connected during these difficult times. And as you just mentioned, Andrew, I hope everyone attending this forum has a safe and healthy and socially distant Thanksgiving.
Thank you so, Mark. And I think I'm going to use that word more often. This is the newsiest year ever. And I would agree with that. I mean, between 3 huge topics, right? COVID-19, historic wildfires, and then the unrest and some of the political violence on our streets. What any one of those would be headlines and look backs on the year. So thank you for everything you're doing at the Trib. And we're thinking about you and appreciative of your support. So thank you, Mark. And before I introduce our board chair, I just want to take a moment because I'm extremely excited about this panel. This is one of the ones I've been looking forward to for some time. And I want to particularly just give a shout out to the Portland Business Alliance's very own John Isaacs. Many of you know him, I'm sure, and connect with him and work with him. And there's any number of good things I could say about John, but I think the one thing that people should know really particularly about him is that he cares about this city and about this region. And I think that's the defining characteristic of his work and what he brings to the table as the lead of our government affairs efforts here at the Alliance. So John, thank you for everything you're doing in advance. I'm looking forward to hearing you today. And with that, I want to introduce our board chair for the Portland Business Alliance, Mike Golub, someone who I truly appreciate his taste in haircuts because we share a similar barber, which is ourselves. So with that, Mike Golub, welcome and thanks for joining us today.
It's a haircut made for the pandemic because you can do it yourself. Welcome, everyone. So glad you could take time every morning to join us for this forum. We've got a really great group of speakers, and we know you'll have questions today. So please submit your questions using the Q&A tool that you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll get to as many as we can. When you do submit your question, please include your full name, your organization, and where your business is located. And feel free to use the chat function throughout the remarks for any comments or observations that you have. And without further ado, I want to introduce our panel for today's forum. Joining us is John Horvick, Director of Client Relations and Political Research with DHM Research. Welcome, John. Paige Richardson, co-founder of Springwater Partners. Nigel Jaquis, news reporter with Willamette Week, and the aforementioned John Isaacs, who's the Vice President of Government Affairs at the PBA. Welcome, everybody, and I'll throw it to you, John.
Yeah, hi, everyone. John Isaacs, Vice President of Government Affairs with the Portland Business Alliance. We're all going to tell you a little bit about what we do. I lead the Alliance's policy, advocacy, and political work. I worked in politics, public affairs, and campaigns for 26 years now. I still can't believe I say that. Mostly around the country, and then for the last 15 to 20 years here in Oregon. Just really honored to be on this panel with this amazing group. And with that, I'll turn it over to Paige to tell you what she does.
And here we go, operate the Zoom. Good morning, Paige Richardson. I euphemistically describe myself as a fourth generation election engineer. I grew up in Appalachia, where my family has been politically involved forever. So it would have been shocking if I didn't get into politics. I have made Oregon my home for, I can't even count how many years now, 30 years, I think, at this point. And have had the privilege of working in campaigns, similar to John, around the country, but in the last decade here, more locally. I've been working my way down the ticket, which is the opposite direction of most folks. And I've really been enjoying being more involved in local races, and excited to talk to you all this morning about what just happened and what that means for our future. And I'm going to kick it to John.
Thank you, Paige, and thank you, PBA. John Horvick, the political director at DHM Research. We're an independent, nonpartisan public opinion firm. So I'm a pollster. I like to say that what my job is to ask people what sort of communities they want to live in. And we work primarily here in the Pacific Northwest, a lot in the Portland metro region, of course, but across Oregon. In addition to doing survey research, I also do a lot of qualitative research. So in non-COVID days, I'd spend a lot of my time traveling across Oregon, sitting down at the table, whether it's in Pendleton or Medford or Bend or here in the metro area, talking to people about their communities and policy issues that affect their lives. So both the numbers and the stories, hopefully what I can bring to this. And then I think I throw it over to Nigel.
Thanks, John, and thanks to the PBA for having us here today. I'm Nigel Jaquis. I'm a reporter at Willamette Week. I came to Oregon in 1997. I'd worked after college for 11 years as an oil trader in New York and Singapore, so a little bit of a different background. So I've been at Willamette Week for nearly 23 years, covering mostly politics, both state and local. In this last cycle, I spent more time on city elections, so excited to talk about those today.
Hey, I get to kick off the conversation. Good people, I want to, one disclaimer. Any problems with the program are not due to the good people at Portland Business Alliance. And probably not even my colleagues. They've given us preparation and script, and so I will warn you right away that I'm terrible at staying on script. But I think I can start it off correctly. So there's nobody that is listening with us this morning who hasn't been watching what's happening, or you wouldn't be here this morning. So there is a ton to cover about this year's election. We could spend the morning talking about just the national, but let's let's try to truncate that. So I want to kick it off with discussion about more local and statewide pieces. So John H., Mr. Horvick, you get to go first as our numerical and statistician expert.
Well, I guess in any election, right, there's lots of stories we could tell, and some of them may be contradictory to each other. But locally, I'm sort of going to use the phrase relative moderation to describe what's happened locally and increasing division across the state. So relative moderation, at City Hall, you had, I would say, the two more moderate or centrist candidates win, with Mayor Wheeler winning re-election and Megas Maps defeating Chloe Udaly. On the funding side, the Metro Transportation measure going down, it's the first significant funding measure in the Portland metro region to fail since, I believe, 2011, when the PPS bond measure failed. So, voters in the region rejecting tax measures, now certainly there's smaller ones that have occurred in suburban areas, but of something the size and scale is pretty unusual. So those are like some signs locally. I'd say statewide, there's even some signs of moderation as well. That the Democrat or the Republicans had a relative sort of success as much as they can in the legislature. A lot of attention's been paid to the coast and that the Republicans will be in those states. A little bit of attention has been paid to Central Oregon as well. The Bend, Deschutes County area really is becoming bluer. I would say one sort of other notable thing more locally is Washington County. It's got a little bit less attention because it hasn't flipped from blue to red or red to blue, but it's just becoming very deep blue. In 2000, Al Gore won Washington County by 2 percentage points. In 2008, Obama won Washington County, I think, by 22 percentage points, and Biden's going to win Washington County by 35 percentage points. And if you just sort of think of the impact of that statewide, Democrats can continue to be in an extremely dominant position if they are crushing it in Multnomah County, and Republicans are getting walloped in Washington County. So that's really another trend to be paying attention to. And then statewide, there's lots of ways we could think about sort of the different directions the regions of the state are going. But a number that really sticks out to me is this: if Multnomah County, Biden's going to win by, I think, 61 percentage points. If you go down to Lake County in Southern Oregon, Trump is going to win by 61 percentage points. Okay, in the mid 1990s, the typical county was about a 6 percentage point difference. Okay, now the typical county is about a 33 percentage point difference. And so not only has the metro area become blue and the rest of the state become redder, but that trend has been really accelerating the last couple cycles. And so those are some of the things I'm paying attention to. Relative moderation here locally, Washington County becoming deeper blue, but across the state, increasing division. And then I think, Nigel, what's your take?
So every cycle, I think that reporters and pollsters and political consultants always worry about what voters are actually seeing, because there is a huge machine that spreads information, not all of it accurate. And so we always wonder, especially when you have a big and complicated ballot, as we did in November, yes, and get to what's really there. And voters, as John pointed out, who said no to Metro's funding measures that I can remember, but who were discerning enough to look at a Water Bureau measure, a City of Portland Water Bureau measure, which most people didn't even know was on the ballot. It would have given the Water Bureau the ability to spend some money to mow the grass at 7 hydro parks around the city. But many of you will recall that the Water Bureau in the past has had some overspending problems. So how voters were able to say yes, 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 no to Metro, and then no to this Water Bureau measure, to me shows that they're really paying attention, that they have long memories, and that you can't really slide anything past them. So I think that's a refreshing example of how smart our voters are. Second thing, I would agree with John on there's both a polarization that is growing and a moderation that we saw in this cycle. I wonder, and I'd love to hear John Isaacs' thoughts on this. I think the democratic machine that we all know in this city and this state was severely hampered by its inability to knock on doors, to go to people's houses. And I'll point to one example, actually two. Brad Witt, who's a longtime incumbent House member in Columbia County, very nearly lost his seat. Going the other direction, heading east, Anna Williams, who was a pretty good freshman ahead of her opponent, Jeff Helfrich. Williams is a rookie, beat him by nearly 1,000. Talk about Lake County, but even very close in counties adjacent to Multnomah County, we saw some very interesting results that would suggest that Oregon is not as deep. John Isaacs.
Unmute. Need to unmute. Yeah, I think you just kicked it to me, Nigel. First, I want to say that I 100% agree with something Nigel just said, that one of the, I'm just going to say, I think it was an error by the Democrats nationally this cycle was to not knock doors. That's a strength of the party. And I actually was, my opinion was sought out by some within the party here who didn't agree with that and felt that there were ways to safely do that. And the strategic decision was made not to. And I do think that that had an impact on the results in many places actually around the nation. I think that's one area where the media was onto that and was reporting on it and got it right. I just wanted, a couple of takeaways from me are, one, that I think one of the successes overall for our community this cycle was the return to the voters once again prioritize competence in their elections and voted for stability. And that to me, you could see play out here in John Horvick. I would also add, in addition to the Mingus Maps wins and the Mayor Wheeler being reelected in a very tough situation, Dan Ryan just before then winning, that sort of jungle primary to replace the late Commissioner Fish. I mean, that had numerous viable candidates when it started and came down to a runoff where he was an underdog in terms of name identification and still pulled it off. And so you had 3 elections in a row where, for Portland, you had the more moderate candidate win. I joke all the time that if you took any one of those 3 and put them in 97% of cities in the country, they'd be the most liberal member of that city council. But for Portland, they were moderate. And then, Carmen Rubio winning her primary outright. Carmen's definitely a progressive, but she's very pragmatic and collaborative, right? She has just numerous fans around the city because of her leadership style. So you had 4 straight elections where you had competence, moderation, the desire for collaboration really, I think, won out. I also think the point Nigel made about long memories, that voters do pay attention, they track things over time, played into the Ryan Loretta Smith runoff as well. And then, so, I also think you saw this desire for stability, slower change, less drama play out nationally. I know you said not to talk nationally, Paige, but I just think it was a clear trend where you clearly had ticket splitting going on in the national elections around the country. Voters who voted for Trump and then split and voted for Republican in US Senate races. We've been through 14 years now of, all of the Senate races going the same way as the top of the ticket, breaking one way or the other. And that's not what happened this year. We saw a clear difference between the choice for president and then, voters going in all kinds of different directions in Senate races and congressional races. So to me, the message is we want stability, we want competence, we want collaboration, we want problem solved. We're done with ideology for now. And we want to see things get done. And I think that's especially important at a city level where, I think that the discussion in City Hall the last 2 years has been primarily ideological and less focused on the things a city is supposed to do: deliver services, clean up streets, make sure we have a safe community. And I think voters want to return to those things.
Okay, so I get to wrap this one up. So I'll jump in and then Nigel, you can come back. John, since you opened the door on the national stuff, I don't disagree. And I'm glad you brought it in because of course it's on everybody's mind. I think I would attribute a lot of that to the record voter turnout. We live in this turnout bubble in Oregon, where we usually hit in a general election 70% is the lowest we get, and nationally we did not reach 70%, but it is the highest turnout we've ever seen in the United States of America. So and then in Portland we live in an additional turnout bubble because we go even higher. I want to say, yes, I agree with everything that folks said, including some of the stability piece, but voters overwhelmingly supported massive change to our policing system. So we didn't pull back on everything. So that's super interesting to me. And some of it is the additional participation, but in Portland and in Oregon, we actually didn't break turnout record. Well, we break numbers of people, but not by percentage. So that was interesting. Nigel, you had something you wanted to say, so I'll just stop so you can jump.
Yes, so actually, I think supposed to move us on to our next question, which is going to refocus us on City Hall. And this we'll start with John Horvick and then Paige following him. So how will the City Council be different in 2021 in terms of both policy that the council works on and the leadership styles of the people who are on the council? John Horvick, you first, please.
Well, I'll say, as a pollster, I'm more comfortable imagining what 500,000 people will do than what 5 individuals might do. But on the personality, I think that John's description sort of is accurate, that they would come in with a different, at least the first days that they're going to be there, some council members that are going to be more focused on nuts and bolts and maybe less on ideological sort of endeavors. That said, the members will have to work with each other and we'll see how things emerge. Some things that I'm really paying attention to, I really do think that the call from a loud group and not an instant number of voters for police defunding or significantly reducing the police, I think this election outcome really exposed that that is not a majority position in the city. And that is likely to change the conversations in City Hall. That's one thing. The other is that as we, hopefully we continue to move through COVID, hopefully we get a vaccine and these days move beyond us. I will remind people that the #1 issue for voters headed into November in the city of Portland was not COVID, was not the economy, it was not protests, it was not policing, it was homelessness. And so that issue emerging again in City Hall would be one that I would expect, because it's not going anywhere and voters consistently have said for a long time that they want something done about that. And then the last one I'm curious about is looking at particularly the mayoral election, but also you see it in the city council election between Maps and New Daily, is just in the geography of support. Wheeler did best in the wealthiest parts of the city and the poorest parts of the city. And I'm really going to be curious how electeds in City Hall interpret that election outcome. The fact that sort of East Portland voted for the mayor, when I think it was the more progressive and liberal candidates who really believed that they existed to advocate on their behalf, but voters chose the other candidates. How they interpret that, both in terms of policy and in their own politics, is something I'll be watching. Paige?
Thanks, John. I was making notes while you were talking, and I've thought about this a lot. And I do get to go a little bit more on the micro level. Dan Ryan was my client in the runoff. I didn't have him in that big primary, but he was my client in the runoff, so I got to know him. I've worked with the mayor. I've worked with Commissioner Hardesty on police reform and Portland Clean Energy Fund. And then Carmen Rubio was also my client. This is unusual for me. I have never had those kind of relationships in City Hall before, but I feel like it gives me a view into who these folks are and how they operate a little bit. And what I will say is they all care. Mingus is the only one I don't know, but the 4 that I do know care deeply about the city of Portland. They care deeply about every resident here. They may disagree on how to get there. but they are all working towards the same pieces, and the sorting of the priorities is going to be interesting to see. Good point to remind us that homelessness was #1, but the other issue that is going to pop back up to the top, I bet, is climate. As soon as we get past COVID, but even now, I'm already anecdotally hearing people talk more about climate, and we are in Portland, everywhere now, with the onslaught of national media that is ubiquitous for all of us in our palms all day long. We are driven by those trends as well, and Biden seems to be, going to be leading off with both COVID and climate potentially. So I think we should watch for that. And then John mentioned Carmen as a pragmatist. Dan works on numbers, and he's outcomes driven. And so he's going to be looking for, how do we get more out of the dollars we're spending in order to take care of the challenges that we face. Ted, I think, has a new lease on life, sort of like he's the second term mayor for the first time. And I'm hoping that he finds some freedom. And I do think he also deeply understands that most Portlanders did not vote for him, and that he's got to figure that out. And as do all of them, because the city of Portland, governing the city of Portland, is like being the cashier at your favorite coffee shop or something. It's a very retail job. And so when the customers are unhappy, you hear about it. And that, I think, politicians in general across the country, but locally, have not figured out how to live in the new world of total transparency and immediate interface with voters. So they're too reactive to Twitter. They're too focused on these sort of measures, when really on a Twitter feed, you've got 9% of people making 81% of comments, and our elected public officials are making that adjustment, but they're not there yet. So they're still going to be vulnerable to that piece. So I'll stop. There's so much more to be said there, but I'm either kicking it to John Isaacs. Is that where we're going next, Nigel? Isaacs, jump.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on this, and I'll add so one other thought on what this really means for the business community. But one thing I think you're going to see improve, at least this is from the business community perspective at City Hall, is there's going to be less of a disconnect between the dialogue that takes place within the city and where the broader community is. Our perspective was that the disconnect. I think that the average Portland resident would be shocked to be at any City Hall hearing any week at just how far to the left the dialogue, all the way down to the language, the tactics, the policies being proposed, things got the last 2 years. And I think you're going to see more of a connection between where the community is and where the city council is. I think the city council is going to do a much better job of focusing on the priorities that, again, the typical Portland resident cares about. And I think that, the example we talked about here, the police accountability measure, is a perfect example of that. The police accountability measure passed with over 80% of the vote. Paige, is that correct? 80? Yeah, I mean, like, overwhelmingly. That is as close to everybody voting for something in politics that you get. But clearly, we had a showdown that was forced by the progressive left in the city. I mean, it was a coordinated effort between two campaigns, Commissioner Hardesty, to force a vote pre-election on the police budget that clearly they believed was a political advantage for them to do that. Why else force it the week before the election when it clearly was not? It was clearly, they played right into the mayor's hands on that issue. And that's an example for me where community rallied around a measure that they believe will bring reform that they care about and they strongly support, but it isn't radical reform. It's not instantaneous radical change. And that this election was about, hey, we want a progressive community, we want progressive change, but we don't want it all at once. And we want the basics to get done as well. And so I think you're going to see less of that disconnect. And I do think this is where things like Twitter come into it. Paige, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, Dan Ryan will tell you he had 150 Twitter followers and he won a campaign where a lot of these campaigns are battled out on Twitter, and it's almost become overemphasized when 80% of people who live here are not on Twitter. And then I'll just end, and then I'll kick it over to, I think I'm kicking it over to Nigel. what this is really going to mean this means for the business community, one, we our voice is going to matter more. And if you go look at how we talked about this entire election cycle, we did not look for pro-business candidates or non-pro business candidates. What we cared about was collaborative leadership. We are, I think, as the Alliance demonstrated with the homeless services measure this year, we are committed to working in coalitions to solve problems. But we have to get out of this mode of perfection has to be the only policy that can pass. And if it has any involvement from the employer community, somehow that's bad. And I think that we got there in the last 2 years. And I think that that is going to sort of be in the past. And now I think you're going to see a higher value in the business community having a seat at the table with the rest of the community. I also think that we learned that, you know, if we are united and we are confident in our messaging and that we identify the areas where we connect with, again, the typical voter in Portland, the business community can win campaigns here. You know, when I started this job, there was a feeling that, you know, we were never going to be able to win a political victory here. And I think that we showed, the business community showed that when it is united, as we were in the Metro, Stop the Metro Wage Tax campaign, we can win. And I think that's going to be, we're going to have more strength going forward because of this cycle. And then I'll stop talking now. Sorry, I get going too much. And Nigel, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic as well.
Sure. So since we saw in 2016, the business community spent nearly $30 million to defeat Measure 97. And I think it left everybody feeling kind of beaten and battered and not necessarily even great about it because, of course, a new version of 97 came back in the legislature and passed. So yeah, the business community won in the Metro measure, and I think that's really important from that. And if the lesson is we can win, that's kind of half the message. That puts things in, it keeps things in sort of an adversarial place where I don't think the community moves forward. So I think the opportunity is that it does show people that the business community is not just what's the Charlie Brown metaphor, the kid who always gets kicked, but can rise up. And so to what purpose? I think people have talked about the fact that we'll have a very moderate council, and I feel like a lottery ticket buyer. Every 2 years, I find a reason to be optimistic about the new council, and then they break my heart. I'm optimistic that this council can be very functional. I think with Wheeler, Maps, and Ryan and Rubio, you have people that are pretty moderate. With Hardesty, you've got somebody who is if you go back to what Hardesty's really about, you go back to somebody who cut her political teeth in the minority in the legislature. And I think that was a great teacher. And I think if you watch her every week at City Hall, she retains that kind of let's do business and move on. It's not personal. So I think you have 5 members of the council that can work with the business community and communicate with the business community and don't see them as evil. So that's a huge opportunity, one that we haven't seen for a long time. For me, going back and looking at Vera Katz's success as mayor and even Neil Goldschmidt, who worked very well with the business community, would use that big room on the top floor of City Hall to convene people and say, okay, we've got a problem. It's a problem for all of us. How are we all going to work together to fix it? But to my way of thinking over the past 10, 15 years, it's been much more adversarial. It has been, hey, City Hall, you fix the problem, or hey, business community, you guys are not in step with us. And so the opportunity in this election is to have everybody pulling in the same direction. That sounds like Pollyanna, and maybe it's unrealistic, but I do think that by winning, the business community has probably earned a lot of respect where it might not have had it before. And by having a more moderate council, you've got people who are willing to work with you more than you had before. So here's the opportunity. I hope it will result in positive outcomes.
I'm chomping at the bit to get in on this. Do I get to go next? Right on. Thank you,
Let's
John.
just go when we want now.
I agree and disagree with Nigel all at the same time. The opportunity, yes. The moderation piece, yes. Thank you for calling out Commissioner Hardesty as somebody who served in the legislature. She's got the most experience, sort of making laws of anybody up there, next to maybe Ted, who's actually was never a legislator, but has been an executive in all of his positions. And you're right, she doesn't take things personally, or she leaves them. And so you haven't had this opportunity before. Really good point on the adversarial nature. The business community, the one takeaway for you all is you have to be more engaged and involved in civic life. And I think what happens now, I don't really know, not on the inside of any of your businesses, but I feel like there's like, we're going to have a day of service and we give money to this nonprofit. That is not the same. We need your expertise. If Portland and our elected officials could solve the problems that we're facing, they would be solved. We need other brains on this problem. We need more experience on these issues, right? And it's going to take the whole community. And I don't think we've ever lived in a world where we successfully said, okay, you 3 people or you 5 people handle this with your, internal staff for 650,000 of us. So I implore you to consider looking at the ways that you have been engaged and encourage your elected officials to accept different ways. To Nigel's point, there's this storied time in Portland and Oregon's past where the communities came together. There's somebody on the Dan Ryan team actually told me about this. They were here in the 70s and the city didn't have enough money to get anything done. They didn't have any choice but to partner. She maybe described it differently than I am now, but everybody came together and we got things like Pioneer Courthouse Square and Waterfront Park and these assets that we love and cherish to this day. So that's, if you take one thing away, take away that you need to be more engaged and don't take no for an answer on engagement, but also we're all going to have to let go of our adversarial nature and really focus on the things we have in common. I have learned this with my in-laws for 20 years, and I've learned this with politics for a lifetime, right? We all have more in common than we do different. And when we can focus on that commonality, then just don't even talk about the things you don't agree on. Everybody in this town agrees we need to work on homelessness. Everybody agrees we need to get past COVID. And I think most all of us agree that we need to work on our financial underpinnings, both attracting new businesses and supporting the ones that are struggling now, but getting beyond that. So there's lots of agreement. And I really want to encourage you all to think carefully about not retracting. And I would say the same if there were city commissioners on here, and if the mayor is listening, don't just manage internally. This is a retail job. City council, being the mayor of Portland, is a retail job. You've got to manage internally and externally at the same time. So I appreciate the patience there, Mr. Horvick.
If I could I'd say one thing, for just perhaps in a different angle to look at this. And the Stop the Metro Wage Tax was a real success by the business community to organize, to have a clear, consistent message, to fundraise, and to be successful at the ballot. As hard as that was, it's still, I think, easier to say no to something than it is to say yes. And so what's the positive agenda going forward? No doubt that you have ideas about that, but just an acknowledgement. And I guess I would just say this, Portland, this election cycle, for reasons we don't need to remind ourselves, became a political target and a political slogan. Republicans ran across the state, ran against Portland. They didn't run against Kate Brown as much as they have in the past. They ran against Portland. Portland was a target by the president and his rhetoric. What is Portland's reputation across the state, across the country, and globally? How do we rebuild that and bring it back to where it was? And no doubt the business community is going to play, or will need to play, a significant role in that. That goes beyond sort of the politics of this moment, but vital to the success of our community, that we have that sterling reputation once again that we've lost, I think, the last 9 months.
Really good points, John.
So Nigel, what do you think were interesting storylines that, just sort of like interesting tidbits or things that the media thought were interesting, or things voters may have overlooked this cycle?
Well, we've talked a little bit about the coast. I was down on the coast a couple of times this summer reporting on a story about Facebook's debacle with an undersea cable. And I was shocked in Tillamook County, which I always think of as a pretty moderate place. Outpouring of recall Kate Brown signs, the outpour, just the amazing number of Trump signs. And I think the results on the coast where Republicans picked up 3 seats that Democrats thought they might hold. Democrats spent an enormous amount of money, by far the most money ever spent on a House race, to lose by 8 points in a Tillamook County seat. I think we are really in danger of just the desperate polarization that John talked about at the outset. It's there. I mean, if you I think there's a tendency in Portland and in other very blue cities to dismiss the concerns of people in rural parts of their state or rural parts of this country. There's a real anger out there. I think Timber Unity, which some of us in the media may have thought was kind of a faux AstroTurf like bogus exercise in the last legislative session, it's real. It's real, and I think they have captured a level of anger and almost hopelessness in rural Oregon that we may not see when we're riding around Multnomah County. And so I think that to me is kind of an enduring takeaway. I was skeptical that this was an actual movement, and I think there's a danger for us in Portland and in the Willamette Valley to think, well, we've got the population, we've got the industrial base, we've got the economic base. We are the state. We're not the state. And if you watched election night, you watched how red the national map started out, and it got bluer over time. Of course, my wife and I kept talking about this question of how the country became so estranged from kind of fundamental values, and how, even if you were a moderate Democrat, how those states that used to be the blue wall are now so hard for the Democrats to hold. So I think if we're not listening to people who disagree with us, we're just going to allow things to get worse. To your point, John, and I'll stop. I spent a lot of time on Twitter, as a lot of reporters do, and there were people who were shocked, absolutely shocked on election day that Sarah Iannarone lost, because they live in a bubble, they talk to each other, and the level of discourse, and I'm sure I'm going to be called a pearl clutcher here, but the level of discourse over the past 4 years has become extremely different from the previous 20 in my experience. I think Donald Trump made it okay to call your opponents names, to never listen to them, and to demonize them. And I think people who really detest Donald Trump are acting like Donald Trump, and it's not a good look. I'll stop there before I get myself in trouble.
Well, can I jump in here? Is everyone, I want to just follow up on one thing Nigel mentioned, which was that House seat on the North Coast. I last decade, ran the Oregon House Democrats campaign committee when we had to defend that seat. And we did, and we held it, but we actually barely held it in 2004, which I think was the last presidential election that was the closest to this one, where you had an incumbent, highly polarized nation, very emotional on both sides. So I wasn't surprised to see it flip eventually, but by how much was really shocking to me. 8 points, I mean, losing a seat by that much. And I think, one of the questions that's been asked is, what was the impact of everything that happened in Portland, the political violence, Donald Trump's, having the Homeland Security agents here. And I think that, again, you saw it, it really did have an impact on elections. And, John Horvick and I talked a lot about this, but people forget that 3/4 of the state is in the Portland media market. And so if you live in the North Coast, or you lived in Salem, where you also had some battleground races, even parts of the South Coast Senate district that flipped, we're getting Portland news every single night about political unrest, and then eventually just all about violence, right? I mean, at first it was about righteous, peaceful protests for racial justice that had broad support, but it morphed over the months into primarily about violence. And I just don't think there's any question that had an impact on those races. And I'm going to post here, this is like one of these stories that's like for political nerds like me, but I encourage people to read it. One of the takeaways from the Democrats in congressional races around the country was that they never really responded to the attacks that they took on defunding the police. And again, this is from Democrats around the country, that really did turn out to be a political albatross for Democrats across the country, because the party did not devise a coherent response strategy. And it's one of the sort of takeaways on why so many of these swing districts, I think the last time I looked, and at a single toss-up race that were rated by toss-up by Cook Political in congressional races had gone to the Democrats. They all had gone Republicans. I think a few were going to end up in the D column, but it was clearly a really bad night for Democrats in down ticket races. And I just think we in Portland need to think about the impact of the events here, what that had on politics outside of Portland, as Nigel was talking about.
I would just add to that, and statewide surveys that GHM did the 2 months before the election in September and October, statewide, the number one issue that voters said that was important to them in the election were the protests. So that means a lot of voters in outside the Portland metro region were calling out protests. I will say it did fall a bit in October. I think as the wildfires swept the state, that there was more urgency around environmental issues, but still in both September and October, the number one issue was protest.
A huge takeaway and thing to remember, right? Thanks to the three of you for talking about rural versus urban. Here we are with the Portland Business Alliance. Most of us live within this region somewhere, and as much as we might want to be out in nature on a regular basis, none of us have been on the regular since COVID. But our psyche is here and our bubble is here. But Oregon has become really a microcosm of the United States, in that if you go back to the beginning of my political career and you look at the national map, there was a lot of purple, right? There was some blue, there was some red, but there was a lot of purple. Now there is no purple. It is red, it is blue, it is super divided. And Oregon has become that. And we are allowing it to happen when and the national thing is so out of our control here in Oregon, but this state is not. And we are on the verge. I'm generally the more optimistic one of probably this bunch, but I'm super concerned about our financial underpinnings and future, and that we're not wrestling with, because we have divided ourselves so completely. The business community no longer has strong relationships with our legislators. Our legislators, largely Democratic legislators, don't come from the business community. I jokingly say that my people cannot do math, and we cannot do complex financial math for sure, right? And so then it makes it really difficult to work on these issues that are more than the now, and that have impact over time. And every financial issue has impact over time. And we're sitting at, I think a lot of you want to flag the Our Next 20 report that was done a couple of years ago, but I think it hasn't been widely circulated. It's some nonprofits that looked at our financial future and if we're as a state, and the basic premise is if we're not careful in the next 20 years, in order to stay afloat, we'll have to cut $50 billion from public entities. And there's about 900 public entities in Oregon, but $50 billion in cuts across this state over the next 20 years, as opposed to some sort of expansion to cover new things. That's catastrophic. And I don't think that I'm exaggerating in that. And we're not necessarily going there, but we need to be conscious of it. And then we've got to find a way that we're in conversation. I'll go back to this. We've got to be in conversation with each other again. We've got to find a way to focus on and to view each other as a part of a larger family. And yep, I don't always get along with my family, but I'm not going to give up on them. And so we can't give up on rural Oregonians and rural Americans. And I'm particularly able to speak about this, having grown up in West Virginia. Nobody looks up at us West Virginians. And that's starting to happen in Oregon. I've been an Oregonian now for 30 years, and people are starting to, West Virginia is ahead of us on many lists. You never want that to happen. And we still have the opportunity to change it. My native state is probably lost for a very long time, but Oregon is not. But we need to seize we need to seize the opportunity now while the window is still open.
I'd like to follow up on that if I could. When I came to Willamette Week in 1998. We did a cover story. We had a big fat cat on the cover, and it was the Police and Fire Pension Fund. And it said basically the pension fund at 8 Portland. And it was a real threat. I'm going to embarrass him by calling him out here. He's probably not on the call, but Justin Delaney at the Standard was a person who personally got involved. He joined the FPD&R board. He spent years on that work. He worked with former Commissioner Dan Saltzman to bring a controversial ballot measure that passed that changed the form of the pension that police and firefighters get. It moved them into the PERS system. It essentially ended, it took care of this big fat cat. I mean, it didn't take care of it because it's a long-term problem that takes years to work its way through the system financially. But Justin Delaney was an example of a guy who saw a huge problem, a huge fiscal structural problem the city was struggling to deal with, didn't really have the political will to deal with. And he worked with Saltzman and others to actually bring about a real structural, important, positive change. And to me, you know, I haven't written that story. I should have probably, but that's a great example to me of people looking at something and business and City Hall working together to fix something. And so hopefully we can find other ways that could happen.
So we're at about time here, and we have one final thing, and I thought I'd just do 1 minute each person. What just one thing, 1 minute that we can look forward to, you think, now through the next cycle up to 2022? Why don't we start with you, John Horvick?
The 2022 Oregon politics it started the day after the election. Real quickly, we're going to have likely a new congressional seat. The average age of our representatives, and Ron Wyden, assuming he runs again, is 72 years old come 2022. We'll have an open governor's seat in 2022. So I think that the jockeying, particularly on the Democratic side, over the next 2 years is going to be intense. And so if you are interested in policy, there's an opportunity to influence these individuals who are thinking of running. And if you're a political junkie, there'll be lots to watch.
I don't know if do we lose Paige? Nigel, you want to take the 1 minute?
I'm here. I was just putting stuff in the chat.
Okay.
I think one of the most interesting stories in recent political times is the challenge by Representative Janelle Bynum to Speaker Tina Kotek. Kotek is the longest serving speaker in Oregon history. Bynum this week decided to challenge her in an open floor challenge, which will take place when the legislature opens next year. That could have impact on the governor's race, which is the most wide open governor's seat we've seen for decades. There are at least 8 real contenders on the Democratic side, and everybody wants to know what Greg Walden's going to do with the rest of his life on the Republican side. So I think it's going to get incredibly interesting really fast. That Kotek-Bynum battle incorporates another really interesting thread of Oregon politics, which is the emerging power of BIPOC communities. They want a seat at the table. They deserve a seat at the table. They're asking for that seat. And so I think that changes conversations both in City Hall and at the State House in very interesting ways.
I'm going to pivot off of that, or just add to that. If you haven't been paying attention, there are huge changes happening with the number of candidates who are stepping up to run. To Nigel's point, BIPOC candidates and younger candidates who have a different, really are ready to throw out the old systems and move to new ones. A lot of the protests we saw was people reaching their limit on a lot of fronts. And we're going to have to figure out how to do that in a pragmatic way. Recently, President Obama has been speaking about how the left has moved too fast, too far. And there's a backlash to that. And it's also, I think he speaks a lot about rural versus urban. And certainly I feel that from family members who are still living in rural places where they just feel judged and uncared about. BIPOC communities have the same but longer reasons to be upset and frustrated. And it's particularly egregious here in Oregon and Portland in particular, because the entire time I've been here, which is 30 some years, we Democrats promise change, we promise funding, we promise better outcomes, and we never ever deliver. And that's the sole reason for the Portland Clean Energy Fund that was passed in 2018 was BIPOC communities saying, okay, we've been waiting politely, we've been participating in your systems, we've been, taking you at your word, and we can't wait any longer. Because the outcomes for those communities are hugely different than they are for white folks, and especially educated white folks. There's still a set of, if you are now poor in the United States or in Oregon and you fall below a certain level, it is nearly impossible to get back up. And so we're going to have to figure those pieces out. The other thing I want to call your attention to is regional change. Gresham is going to, Beaverton has a new mayor. Gresham is going to have a new mayor. Gresham is going to have a new city council. They have, regardless of whether it's Travis Stovall or Eddie Morales, there are now 4 more progressive votes on the Gresham City Council. That's going to, change pieces out there. And Portland needs to realize that we have sisters, siblings, and that we aren't just, one monolith. And over on Washington County side, Lacey Beatty got elected to mayor out there. Nafisa Faye got elected to the county commission out there. So things are shifting, and yes, more blue, but also you got newer folks. And while that's an interesting dynamic, and they're going to need somebody in another coalition that John and I share, which using the term guide wires or guard, like they're going to need help. And so again, encourage you all to decide how you're going to come together and jump in and lend your expertise, because a lot of the government system is different than a corporation. And it's always frustrating to me when a CEO of a big corporation says, I can run your state government. No, you actually can't. It's very different, but you are really good probably at systems. And so the combination of the two can lead to these really innovative solutions that get us faster for the amount of money that we're going to have. And a heads up on the budget, like everybody be looking at the budget.
Yep. So we have 1 minute. I'm going to go 1 minute. 4 areas of opportunity for the city where we have this opportunity for collaboration to bring all stakeholders together to solve big things. Housing and homelessness, John Horvick called it out. Number 1 issue, we're implementing a homeless services initiative. We're implementing residential infill. If those are done correctly, we have an opportunity to solve the problem. We have the resources for it. We have the policy that can build the housing that we need. Those 2 things have to happen. 2, charter commission. Okay, we did a panel last year where Rachel Monahan for Willamette Week jokingly asked the panel, okay, you all have to say one good thing about Portland City form of government, because there was such a consensus that we need to finally move on from this bifurcated bureau system. That's 2. 3, police reform. We have the measure that the voters overwhelmingly passed. Clearly, voters want to see a reform in our policing policies. And we cannot forget about why the protests started this summer. They're about racial justice and Black economic advancement and Black Lives Matter. It got sort of hijacked into a thing that ended with the Democratic Party getting trashed last week and no presidents being written on it. But let's go back to what that was about, right? It is critical that this community continue forward with that Black Lives Matter agenda. And then the fourth piece is fiscal management, right? I mean, we're going to have to do this together. There's no way to get through the next couple of years without smart, just nuts and bolts governing. And I think if we focus on those things and not keep trying to do new stuff, there's a chance to have a lot of success in the next 2 years. And I think that we're handing it back to Andrew to wrap up.
Thanks for the wrap, John. And just thank you all for the catharsis of politics that you just offered to all of us. I feel like we've emerged from the chrysalis of the November elections, and now we can charge forward with the unknown. So hats off to all of our incredible panelists. And we do have Michelle Weisenbach back on, so I want to turn it over to her for her remarks, and welcome back. And again, Michelle, sorry for the technical feed issues earlier.
No worries. Thank you very much. And I just want to just thanks so much to the Portland Business Alliance for such a wonderful conversation and panel today. I'm so proud that KeyBank can help sponsor these discussions and bring them to all of you. I loved Paige's phrase of, we're all part of a larger family and we can't give up on one another. And I'm going to carry that forward today because I love the sentiment. And I love that we are talking about your voice matters. And, the election was one place where your voice mattered, but that's not where it ends. And we are on a journey to continue to make our community better and more united and to bring forward the change that we want. So just encourage all of you to continue to learn and share your voice and your expertise as we collectively take all the points that our panelists shared today and carry those forward to make the change that we want to see. So thank you very much, Andrew, for allowing me to be here and to say thank you. Thanks for everyone for joining us, and appreciate just the conversation this morning.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And again, to our panelists, and then all those who attended today. I see a lot of really thoughtful political operatives and engaged civic activists within the business community and beyond. So it's so good to see all of you here. I want to flag for you the ultimate crystal ball day, December 8th, where you will hear John Mitchell, just unbelievable character, predict exactly what will happen to the economy in 2021. And I know he has never been wrong. So please join us that day. And to the rest of you, please stay safe, be well, and we hope you celebrate Thanksgiving in a very appropriate way and can be connected to those you love. So with that, have a great day, everyone, and take care of yourselves.